In a quiet corner of the southern United States, Judge Evelyn Carter lived a life many admired but few truly understood. To her colleagues and the people who appeared in her courtroom, she was a symbol of fairness and strength, a federal judge, dedicated to upholding the law without bias or favoritism. Her sharp mind and calm demeanor made her one of the most respected figures in the legal community. But outside the walls of the courthouse, Evelyn's life was far from simple. She faced challenges that no amount of prestige or authority could shield her from. Evelyn had grown up in a modest household, the daughter of a school teacher and a factory worker. From a young age, she learned the value of hard work and determination. Her parents always told her, "Education is your ticket to freedom." And so Evelyn studied tirelessly, earning scholarships and working part-time jobs to pay her way through college and law school. By the time she became a federal judge, she had overcome countless obstacles, some visible, others hidden beneath the surface. But nothing could have prepared her for what happened on that fateful evening. It was a chilly autumn night when Evelyn left the courthouse after an exhausting day. The streets were mostly empty, save for the occasional car passing by. She drove her sleek black sedan carefully, mindful of the speed limit and traffic rules. As she approached a quiet intersection, red and blue lights suddenly flashed in her rearview mirror. Startled, Evelyn glanced at her dashboard to check her speed. She hadn't been going over the limit. Still, she pulled over immediately, turning on her hazard lights as protocol demanded. Her heart began to race as she watched two police officers step out of their patrol car. One walked toward her driver's side window while the other lingered near the back of her vehicle, shining his flashlight into it unnecessarily. Evelyn took a deep breath, reminding herself to stay calm. When the first officer tapped on her window, she rolled it down halfway and greeted him politely. "Good evening, officer," she said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her stomach. "Is there something wrong?" The officer didn't return her politeness. Instead, he barked, "License and registration." His tone was harsh, almost confrontational. Evelyn hesitated for only a moment before reaching into her glove compartment for the requested documents. As she handed them over, the officer glanced at her name and address, then asked, "What kind of job do you have?" Taken aback by the question, Evelyn replied, "I'm a federal judge." The words hung in the air, but instead of eliciting respect, they seemed to provoke further hostility. The officer exchanged glances with his partner, who smirked faintly. "A judge, huh?" the first officer said skeptically. "How does someone like you afford a car like this?" He gestured vaguely at her sedan, his implication clear. Someone like her, a black woman, shouldn't be driving such an expensive vehicle. Evelyn felt a surge of anger but forced herself to remain composed. She knew better than to let emotions cloud her judgment, especially in situations like this. "I bought it legally, sir," she replied evenly. "May I ask why I was pulled over?" The officer ignored her question, continuing his line of intrusive interrogation. He asked about her income, her family, and even where she lived. Each question felt more invasive than the last, designed not to gather information, but to intimidate. Evelyn noticed the second officer lingering nearby, occasionally, chiming in with sarcastic remarks. She realized this wasn't just a routine traffic stop. It was something darker, more personal. Despite her efforts to remain calm, the tension escalated. The officers grew increasingly aggressive, their body language shifting from professional to menacing. At one point, the first officer leaned closer to her window, his face inches away. "You think being a judge makes you special?" he sneered. "We don't care about your fancy title here." Evelyn's hands tightened around the steering wheel, but she refused to rise to the bait. She reminded herself that reacting emotionally would only make things worse. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the officers handed back her documents and told her she was free to go. No ticket, no explanation, just a curt dismissal. As Evelyn drove away, her hands trembled and tears welled up in her eyes. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. When she arrived home, Evelyn sat in her driveway for several minutes trying to process what had just happened. She replayed the encounter in her mind, dissecting every word and gesture. It wasn't just about her, it was about the color of her skin, the assumptions people made based on stereotypes, and the systemic racism that permeated institutions like law enforcement. This wasn't the first time she'd experienced prejudice, but it was perhaps the most blatant and humiliating. Determined not to let the incident consume her, Evelyn decided to take action. She knew she couldn't ignore what had happened, not just for her own sake, but for others who might find themselves in similar situations. That night, she opened her laptop and began documenting every detail of the stop. The time, the location, the badge numbers of the officers, and snippets of dialogue she could recall. She also reviewed footage from the dashcam she kept installed in her car, capturing parts of the interaction that reinforced her account. By morning, Evelyn had compiled a comprehensive report. She shared it with trusted friends and colleagues, seeking advice on how to proceed. Some urged caution, warning her that speaking out could lead to retaliation. Others encouraged her to file a formal complaint, believing that staying silent would only perpetuate the cycle of injustice. After much deliberation, Evelyn chose to move forward. She submitted her complaint to the local police department, attaching copies of all evidence she had gathered. To her disappointment, the response was dismissive. The department claimed the officers had acted appropriately and blamed the situation on a misunderstanding. Frustrated but undeterred, Evelyn resolved to take her fight to a broader audience. She reached out to journalists, civil rights organizations, and activists, sharing her story publicly. Within days, news outlets picked up the case, sparking outrage across social media platforms. Protesters gathered outside the police station, holding signs that read, "Justice for Judge Carter" and "End Police Racism Now." As public pressure mounted, internal investigations reopened. More evidence emerged, including whistleblower testimonies and records of previous complaints against the same officers. What started as a single act of courage turned into a movement, shining a spotlight on systemic issues that had long been ignored. For Evelyn, the journey was far from over, but she knew she had taken the first crucial step toward change. Through it all, Evelyn remained steadfast, drawing strength from the support of her community and the knowledge that her voice mattered. Though the road ahead promised to be difficult, she refused to back down. After all, she wasn't fighting just for herself. She was fighting for everyone who deserved to live in a world where justice wasn't determined by the color of their skin. The days following Evelyn's public disclosure of the incident were a whirlwind of emotions and activity. As her story spread across newspapers, television programs, and social media platforms, reactions poured in from every corner of the country. Supporters rallied behind her, praising her bravery and calling for accountability. Critics, however, dismissed her claims as exaggerations or attempts to gain attention. The divide was sharp, but Evelyn remained focused on the bigger picture, exposing systemic racism within law enforcement and ensuring that no one else would endure what she had. At first, the backlash felt overwhelming. Some anonymous online trolls attacked Evelyn personally, questioning her integrity and accusing her of lying. "If you're really a judge," one comment read, "why are you making such a big deal out of nothing?" Others suggested she was using her position to stir up trouble. These comments stung, not because they were true, but because they revealed how deeply ingrained racial biases were in society. Yet Evelyn refused to let negativity derail her mission. She reminded herself that change often came with resistance, and that the louder the opposition, the more urgent the need for reform. Meanwhile, the local police department scrambled to control the narrative. In a hastily arranged press conference, the police chief defended his officers, insisting they had followed proper protocol during the traffic stop. He described Evelyn's allegations as unfounded and accused her of tarnishing the reputation of an otherwise honorable institution. His words sparked outrage among activists and community leaders, who pointed out the glaring contradictions between his statements and the evidence Evelyn had provided. Protesters gathered outside the station once again, chanting slogans like, "No justice, no peace," and demanding transparency. As pressure mounted, federal authorities intervened. The Department of Justice launched an independent investigation into the incident, examining not only the actions of the two officers involved but also the broader practices of the police force. This development marked a turning point in Evelyn's fight. For months she had battled alone, facing skepticism and hostility at every turn. Now, powerful institutions were stepping in to hold those responsible accountable. It was a small victory, but it gave her hope that meaningful change might be possible after all. During this time, Evelyn leaned heavily on her support system. Friends, family members, and colleagues rallied around her, offering encouragement and practical help. One close friend, a fellow lawyer named Marcus, helped her draft speeches and prepare for interviews. Another, a civil rights activist named Clara, organized rallies and coordinated efforts with grassroots organizations. Together they formed a network of advocates determined to amplify Evelyn's voice and keep the momentum going. Evelyn also began speaking publicly about her experience, sharing her story at community forums, university campuses, and national conferences. Her talks were both personal and powerful, weaving together her own ordeal with broader discussions about systemic racism and police misconduct. She spoke candidly about the fear she had felt during the traffic stop, the frustration of being dismissed by authorities, and the courage it took to speak out. But she also emphasized the importance of collective action, urging audiences to join the fight for justice. "This isn't just my battle," she often said. "It's ours. And until we address the root causes of inequality, none of us can truly be free." Her message resonated deeply, inspiring people from all walks of life to take a stand. High school students organized walkouts in solidarity. College professors incorporated her case into their curricula, sparking classroom debates about race and power. Even celebrities used their platforms to raise awareness, posting videos and articles about Evelyn's story. Slowly but surely, her fight became a national conversation. Behind the scenes, however, the process of seeking justice was anything but smooth. Investigators combed through hours of dashcam footage, interviewed witnesses, and reviewed years' worth of complaints filed against the officers involved. What they uncovered painted a disturbing picture. Both men had histories of racially motivated behavior, including multiple reports of excessive force and discriminatory remarks. Internal memos revealed that supervisors had ignored these red flags, allowing the officers to continue working without consequence. The investigation expanded beyond the two individuals, uncovering systemic issues within the department. Training materials showed outdated and biased protocols, while whistleblower testimonies exposed a culture of silence and complicity. Officers who tried to report misconduct were often ostracized or punished, creating an environment where abuse thrived unchecked. These findings shocked the public and added fuel to the growing demand for reform. For Evelyn, learning about these revelations was both validating and heartbreaking. On one hand, it confirmed what she had suspected all along. Her experience wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a larger pattern. On the other hand, it forced her to confront the depth of the problem, which extended far beyond a single traffic stop. The realization weighed heavily on her, but it also strengthened her resolve. If anything, it made her more determined to see the process through to the end. As weeks turned into months, the case gained even more traction. National news outlets ran feature stories, highlighting not only Evelyn's courage, but also the structural flaws within law enforcement agencies. Nationwide, public figures weighed in, calling for sweeping reforms and increased accountability. Lawmakers introduced bills aimed at addressing racial profiling and promoting transparency in policing. While progress was slow, the momentum was undeniable. Amidst the chaos, Evelyn found moments of solace in unexpected places. Strangers sent letters and emails thanking her for speaking out, sharing their own experiences of discrimination and expressing gratitude for her leadership. Parents told her they were teaching their children about standing up for what's right, using her story as an example. These gestures touched her deeply, reminding her that her efforts were making a difference, even if the impact wasn't always immediately visible. By the time investigators concluded their probe, the nation was watching closely. The findings were damning, Both officers had violated departmental policies and federal laws, engaging in conduct unbecoming of their positions. Worse still, the department itself was implicated in fostering an environment that enabled such behavior. Facing mounting evidence and public scrutiny, officials had no choice but to act. Arrest warrants were issued for the two officers, charging them with misconduct, harassment, and violating civil rights. Several high-ranking officials resigned under pressure, acknowledging their failure to address long-standing issues within the force. For Evelyn, the arrests brought a mix of emotions. Relief washed over her knowing that those responsible would finally face consequences. But anger lingered too. Anger at the system that had allowed this to happen in the first place, and sadness for the countless others who hadn't been believed or supported when they came forward. Still, she recognized the significance of the moment. Accountability, though imperfect, was a step toward healing. In the aftermath, Evelyn continued to advocate for change, refusing to let the spotlight fade. She worked with lawmakers to draft legislation aimed at preventing similar incidents in the future. She partnered with nonprofits to provide resources for victims of police brutality and discrimination. And she kept telling her story, ensuring that the lessons learned wouldn't be forgotten. Through it all, Evelyn never lost sight of why she had started this journey. It wasn't about revenge or personal vindication. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, could feel safe and respected. Her courage had sparked a movement, one that would continue to grow long after the headlines faded. And though the road ahead promised challenges, Evelyn faced them with the same resilience and determination that had carried her thus far. For now, the fight was far from over, but Evelyn knew she wasn't alone. Thousands stood beside her, united in their pursuit of justice. Together, they proved that even the smallest acts of defiance could ignite profound change. The arrest of the two officers marked a pivotal moment in Judge Evelyn Carter's journey, but it was far from the end of her fight. While the initial wave of public support had been overwhelming, Evelyn knew that true justice required more than just holding individuals accountable. It demanded systemic change. The arrests were a victory, yes, but they also exposed the cracks in an institution that had long resisted reform. For Evelyn, this was both a challenge and an opportunity to push for lasting solutions. In the weeks following the arrests, the spotlight remained firmly on the police department. Investigators released their full report, detailing not only the misconduct of the two officers but also the systemic failures that allowed such behavior to persist unchecked. The document revealed shocking patterns: racial profiling, excessive use of force, and a lack of accountability mechanisms. Supervisors had routinely ignored complaints from citizens, dismissing them as misunderstandings or overreactions. Officers accused of wrongdoing were often transferred to different precincts instead of being disciplined, allowing problematic behavior to spread like wildfire. The report sent shockwaves through the community. Protesters returned to the streets, demanding more than just punishment for the guilty officers. They wanted structural reforms. Signs reading "Rebuild Trust" and "Justice over Bias" filled rallies, while chants echoed through city squares. Social media campaigns gained traction, urging lawmakers to pass legislation addressing police accountability and transparency. Celebrities, activists, and even corporate leaders joined the chorus, amplifying the call for change. Evelyn threw herself into this new phase of the movement, using her platform to advocate for concrete policy changes. She met with local officials, state representatives, and federal lawmakers, presenting data-backed proposals aimed at dismantling systemic racism within law enforcement. Her suggestions included mandatory implicit bias training for all officers, the implementation of independent oversight boards, and stricter penalties for misconduct. She also pushed for the widespread adoption of body cameras, arguing that increased visibility would help deter abuse and provide critical evidence when incidents occurred. Her advocacy wasn't without resistance. Some politicians dismissed her ideas as impractical or too costly, while others accused her of undermining law enforcement altogether. "You're painting all cops as bad," one critic said during a televised debate. "What about the good ones?" Evelyn responded calmly, but firmly. "I'm not here to vilify anyone. I'm here to fix a broken system so that every officer can serve with honor, and every citizen can feel safe." Despite the pushback, Evelyn's persistence paid off. Lawmakers began drafting bills inspired by her recommendations, and several states introduced pilot programs testing her proposed reforms. Grassroots organizations took up the mantle, organizing workshops and town hall meetings to educate communities about their rights and how to hold police accountable. Slowly but surely, momentum built, turning what could have been a fleeting moment of outrage into a sustained effort for transformation. While working on legislative changes, Evelyn also focused on supporting victims of police misconduct. She partnered with civil rights groups to create a hotline where people could report incidents anonymously. The initiative quickly gained traction, receiving hundreds of calls within its first month. Many callers shared stories eerily similar to Evelyn's: traffic stops escalating into hostile encounters, questions laced with racial undertones, and dismissive responses when they tried to file complaints. Hearing these accounts reinforced Evelyn's belief that her experience was part of a larger pattern, one that needed urgent attention. To amplify these voices, Evelyn organized a series of public testimonies. Victims and their families stood before crowds, sharing their pain and frustration. One mother recounted how her teenage son had been wrongfully detained after being stopped for no reason other than his race. Another man described how he'd been beaten during an arrest, leaving him with permanent injuries. Each story added weight to the growing demand for justice, reminding everyone involved of the human cost of inaction. As the movement gained steam, Evelyn found herself balancing multiple roles: advocate, spokesperson, counselor, and sometimes even mediator. Community members sought her guidance on everything from filing lawsuits to navigating interactions with law enforcement. Colleagues reached out for advice on how to address bias in their own workplaces. Journalists requested interviews, eager to capture her insights on the evolving situation. Though exhausting, Evelyn embraced each role with unwavering dedication. She understood that her position gave her unique influence, and she refused to waste it. Behind the scenes, Evelyn faced personal challenges. The stress of constant scrutiny took a toll on her mental health. Anonymous threats continued to pour, in some more menacing than others. Friends urged her to step back, warning that burnout could derail her efforts entirely. But Evelyn couldn't afford to stop, not when so much progress depended on her leadership. Instead, she leaned on her support network, attending therapy sessions and setting aside time for self-care whenever possible. These small acts of resilience kept her grounded, enabling her to face each day with renewed purpose. One particularly significant development came when a major news outlet aired a documentary about Evelyn's case. Filmmakers spent months interviewing her, gathering footage from protests and speaking with experts on racial injustice. The resulting film painted a vivid picture of the struggles faced by marginalized communities and highlighted the urgent need for reform. Its release coincided with a national conference on policing, drawing unprecedented attention to the issue. Viewers flooded social media with messages of solidarity, vowing to stay informed and engaged. The documentary also reignited discussions about Evelyn's original complaint against the officers. Critics who had once dismissed her claims now apologized, publicly, acknowledging the validity of her concerns. Even some former skeptics admitted they had underestimated the extent of the problem. This shift in perception validated Evelyn's decision to speak out, proving that courage and persistence could sway even the most hardened minds. Meanwhile, legal proceedings against the arrested officers moved forward. Both men pleaded not guilty, claiming they had simply been doing their jobs. Their defense attorneys argued that Evelyn's status as a federal judge made her uniquely capable of manipulating the system, a claim that sparked outrage among supporters of the movement. Protesters gathered outside the courthouse daily, holding signs that read "Truth over lies" and "No excuses for racism." Inside, Evelyn testified with poise and precision, recounting the events of that fateful night and explaining why she believed the officers' actions constituted harassment. As the trial unfolded, additional evidence emerged, further implicating The defendants. Text messages exchanged between the two officers revealed derogatory language and jokes about minorities. Surveillance footage from nearby businesses corroborated Evelyn's account, showing the aggressive manner in which they approached her vehicle. Expert witnesses testified about the psychological impact of racial profiling, emphasizing the trauma inflicted on victims. With each revelation, the prosecution's case grew stronger, while the defense struggled to counter mounting allegations. By Tioin. The time closing arguments concluded. Public interest had reached a fever pitch. News outlets provided live updates and social media buzzed with speculation about the verdict. When the jury finally delivered its decision, guilty on all counts, the courtroom erupted in applause. Outside, cheers echoed through the streets as supporters celebrated the outcome. For many, it felt like a rare moment of triumph in a long and grueling battle. For Evelyn, the verdict brought a sense of closure, but not satisfaction. Justice had been served, yet the underlying issues remained unresolved. Systemic racism wasn't confined to a single department or incident. It permeated every level of society. Addressing it would require ongoing vigilance and collective action. Still, the conviction represented a crucial step forward, a reminder that accountability was possible, even in the face of entrenched resistance. With the trial behind her, Evelyn turned her focus back to advocacy. She launched a nonprofit organization dedicated to combating racial injustice, channeling funds toward education, legal aid, and community empowerment programs. She traveled across the country, delivering keynote speeches at conferences and universities, inspiring audiences with her resilience and vision. And she continued to work closely with lawmakers, ensuring that the policies enacted reflected the needs of those most affected. Through it all, Evelyn never lost sight of her ultimate goal, creating a world where fairness and equality weren't aspirations but realities. Her journey had been fraught with challenges, but it had also shown her the power of unity and determination. Every protest, every policy change, and every voice raised in defiance brought society closer to that ideal. And though the road ahead promised obstacles, Evelyn walked it with hope, knowing she wasn't alone. Together, she and countless others were rewriting the rules of justice, one courageous act at a time. The guilty verdict against the two officers was a landmark moment, but for Judge Evelyn Carter, it was merely the beginning of a much larger chapter. The conviction sent a clear message that racial harassment and misconduct by law enforcement would no longer be tolerated, at least not without consequences. Yet Evelyn knew that true justice required more than holding individuals accountable. It demanded systemic overhauls to prevent future abuses. Her focus shifted from personal vindication to creating lasting change, a mission that tested her resolve in ways she hadn't anticipated. In the months following the trial, Evelyn became a national figurehead for police reform. Her name appeared in headlines alongside those of civil rights leaders past and present. Invitations poured in from organizations eager to collaborate with her on initiatives aimed at dismantling systemic racism. Universities invited her to deliver commencement speeches. Corporations sought her counsel on diversity and inclusion strategies, and grassroots movements looked to her as a guiding light. Though flattered by the attention, Evelyn approached these opportunities with humility, always reminding herself that this fight wasn't about her. It was about the countless lives affected by injustice. One of Evelyn's first major undertakings was launching her nonprofit organization, Justice Beyond Borders. The initiative focused on three key areas: education, advocacy, and empowerment. Through educational programs, the nonprofit trained community members on their legal rights during police interactions, teaching them how to document incidents and file complaints effectively. Advocacy efforts included lobbying for stronger accountability measures within law enforcement agencies, such as independent oversight boards and mandatory body cameras. Empowerment initiatives provided grants to grassroots organizations working to combat racial inequality at the local level. Evelyn threw herself into building the nonprofit, often working late into the night drafting proposals, meeting with donors, and coordinating with volunteers. Friends worried about her workload, but she insisted that the stakes were too high to slow down. "If we don't act now," she told a close confidant, "the momentum will fade, and nothing will change." Her dedication paid off. Within a year, Justice Beyond Borders had established partnerships with dozens of organizations nationwide. Fundraising events drew thousands of attendees, raising millions of dollars to support reform efforts. High-profile endorsements from celebrities and business leaders helped amplify the nonprofit's reach, bringing its message to audiences who might otherwise have remained unaware of the issue. Even skeptics began to take notice, impressed by the tangible results Evelyn's team achieved. While managing the nonprofit, Evelyn continued her work on legislative reforms. She collaborated closely with lawmakers to draft bills addressing police accountability and transparency. One of her most ambitious proposals called for the creation of a national database tracking officer misconduct. Under this system, any officer found guilty of serious violations would be barred from serving in law enforcement anywhere in the country. Critics argued that such a measure would infringe on states' rights, but Evelyn countered that protecting citizens should take precedence over bureaucratic concerns. "We're talking about saving lives," she said during a congressional hearing. "Is there really any argument against that?" Her testimony resonated with many legislators, leading to bipartisan support for several of her proposals. By the end of her first year of advocacy, 2 major pieces of legislation inspired by her recommendations had been signed into law. The first mandated comprehensive training programs for all law enforcement officers, focusing on de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness. The second established stricter guidelines for handling complaints against officers, ensuring that investigations were conducted fairly and transparently. These victories were hard-won, but Evelyn celebrated them quietly, knowing there was still much work to be done. Despite the progress, resistance persisted. Some police unions pushed back fiercely against the reforms, claiming they undermined officers' ability to do their jobs safely. Others accused Evelyn of harboring anti-police sentiments, despite her repeated insistence that she respected law enforcement professionals committed to serving honorably. Tensions escalated when a series of high-profile incidents involving police shootings reignited protests across the nation. Protesters adopted slogans like "Defund the police" and "Abolish qualified immunity," further polarizing public opinion. Caught in the crossfire, Evelyn worked tirelessly to bridge the divide. She organized town hall meetings where community members could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials. These dialogues were often tense, with emotions running high on both sides. But Evelyn mediated skillfully, encouraging participants to listen to one another and find common ground. In one particularly memorable session, a grieving mother whose son had been killed by police shared her story alongside an officer who described the challenges of balancing safety with compassion. Tears flowed freely as the audience absorbed their words, underscoring the complexity of the issue. Evelyn also recognized the importance of amplifying voices beyond her own. She used her platform to highlight stories of resilience and courage from marginalized communities. At a national conference on racial justice, she introduced a young activist named Jamal, whose brother had been wrongfully arrested and beaten by police. Jamal spoke passionately about his efforts to hold authorities accountable, inspiring listeners with his determination. Later, Evelyn joined forces with Jamal to launch a mentorship program connecting youth from underserved neighborhoods with mentors in fields like law, education, and social work. The program quickly gained traction, offering hope and guidance to participants eager to break cycles of poverty and discrimination. As her influence grew, so did the threats against her. Hate mail arrived almost daily, some containing graphic language, others veiled warnings of violence. Security experts advised Evelyn to hire a full-time bodyguard, but she resisted, unwilling to let fear dictate her life. Instead, she relied on friends and colleagues to accompany her to events and kept a low profile when traveling alone. Despite the danger, she refused to shy away from speaking out, believing that silence would only embolden her detractors. Amidst the chaos, moments of joy reminded Evelyn why she had chosen this path. Letters from supporters poured in, thanking her for giving them hope and inspiring them to take action. A grandmother wrote to say she was teaching her grandchildren about standing up for what's right using Evelyn's story as an example. A college student shared how attending one of Evelyn's speeches had motivated him to pursue a career in civil rights law. These messages buoyed her spirits, reinforcing her belief that every effort mattered, no matter how small. One of the most transformative experiences came when Evelyn visited a rural town devastated by decades of neglect and systemic racism. Residents greeted her warmly, sharing stories of struggle and perseverance. Many expressed frustration with local authorities, who they claimed ignored their needs and dismissed their grievances. Moved by their plight, Evelyn spent hours listening to their concerns and brainstorming solutions. Before leaving, she promised to return with resources and support, vowing to ensure their voices were heard. True to her word, she arranged for a team of lawyers and activists to visit the town, providing free legal aid and organizing workshops on civic engagement. Back home, Evelyn faced new challenges as political winds shifted. Elections brought changes in leadership, with some newly elected officials opposing her reform agenda. Budget cuts threatened funding for critical programs, forcing her to make difficult decisions about which initiatives to prioritize. Yet, even in the face of adversity, Evelyn remained steadfast. She adapted her strategies, finding creative ways to stretch limited resources and rallying supporters to apply pressure on decision-makers. Through it all, Evelyn drew strength from the relationships she had built along the way. Marcus, her trusted friend and fellow lawyer, continued to offer invaluable advice, helping her navigate complex legal battles. Clara, the civil rights activist, spearheaded grassroots campaigns, mobilizing communities to demand action. And her family, her rock through every storm, reminded her to pause and celebrate milestones no matter how minor they seemed. By the end of the second year, Evelyn's efforts had yielded remarkable results. Reforms implemented in response to her advocacy had begun to show promise, with data indicating a decline in complaints of racial profiling and excessive force in departments that adopted her recommendations. Independent oversight boards had successfully investigated numerous cases of misconduct, leading to disciplinary actions against offending officers. Body camera footage had exonerated innocent civilians falsely accused of crimes, while simultaneously holding abusive officers accountable. But perhaps the greatest testament to Evelyn's impact was the cultural shift she helped inspire. Conversations about race and policing, once taboo or dismissed as divisive, had entered mainstream discourse. Schools incorporated lessons on systemic racism into their curricula. Businesses prioritized diversity and inclusion, and media outlets amplified underrepresented voices. As Judge Evelyn Carter entered the third year of her advocacy journey, the landscape around her had transformed dramatically, but not entirely for the better. The reforms she championed were beginning to take root, and public awareness about systemic racism in law enforcement was at an all-time high. Yet resistance to change remained fierce, manifesting in unexpected ways that tested Evelyn's resolve like never before. For every step forward, there seemed to be a counterforce determined to push back. One of the most significant challenges came from within the political sphere. Newly elected officials, many backed by powerful police unions, began rolling back some of the hard-won reforms. They argued that measures like independent oversight boards and mandatory body cameras placed undue burdens on officers, making it harder for them to do their jobs effectively. Critics claimed these policies created a culture of distrust between law enforcement and the communities they served. Some even went so far as to accuse Evelyn and her allies of waging a war on cops, framing their efforts as anti-police rather than pro-accountability. Evelyn knew this narrative was dangerous. If left unchecked, it could undermine years of progress. She responded by doubling down on education and outreach, emphasizing that reform wasn't about vilifying law enforcement, but about ensuring fairness and safety for everyone. She partnered with retired police chiefs and veteran officers who supported accountability measures, bringing them into discussions to share their perspectives. These voices added credibility to her arguments, helping to dispel myths perpetuated by opponents of reform. At the same time, Evelyn faced growing divisions within the movement itself. While grassroots activists and organizations aligned with her vision of gradual systemic change, others advocated for more radical approaches. Calls to defund the police gained traction after several highly publicized incidents of police brutality reignited protests nationwide. Protesters marched through city streets demanding immediate action to dismantle what they saw as inherently oppressive institutions. Slogans like "No justice, no peace" and "Abolish qualified immunity" dominated rallies, capturing media attention and sparking heated debates. Evelyn understood the frustration driving these calls for drastic measures. Years of broken promises and unaddressed grievances had left many feeling disillusioned with incremental change. Still, she believed that dismantling entire systems without viable alternatives risked creating chaos rather than solutions. Instead, she proposed a middle path, reallocating portions of police budgets to fund community-based programs while simultaneously strengthening accountability mechanisms within law enforcement agencies. This approach aimed to address underlying issues, like poverty, lack of mental health resources, and inadequate education, that often contributed to crime, thereby reducing the need for policing in the first place. To bridge the gap between opposing factions, Evelyn organized a series of roundtable discussions. Activists, policymakers, academics, and law enforcement representatives gathered to debate strategies for achieving meaningful reform. These conversations weren't always easy. Tempers flared and disagreements sometimes threatened to derail the process. But Evelyn mediated skillfully, encouraging participants to focus on shared goals rather than ideological differences. Over time, common ground emerged. Ideas like crisis intervention teams composed of social workers and mental health professionals gained support, as did proposals to decriminalize minor offenses and invest in restorative justice programs. While navigating these complexities, Evelyn also dealt with increasingly aggressive attempts to discredit her work. Anonymous online campaigns accused her of hypocrisy, pointing out instances where decisions in her courtroom had resulted in harsh sentences for defendants. Opponents seized on these claims, portraying her as inconsistent and opportunistic. One op-ed titled "Judge or Activist" questioned whether her advocacy undermined her impartiality as a federal judge. The accusations stung, but Evelyn refused to let them distract her. She addressed the criticisms head-on, explaining that her role as a judge required upholding the law as written, regardless of personal beliefs. At the same time, she argued that advocating for reform outside the courtroom didn't conflict with her judicial duties. It complemented them by addressing systemic flaws that courts alone couldn't fix. Her transparency won over skeptics, reinforcing her reputation as a principled leader committed to truth and integrity. Despite the backlash, Evelyn's influence continued to grow. Her nonprofit, Justice Beyond Borders, expanded its reach, launching new initiatives aimed at empowering marginalized communities. One particularly impactful program provided scholarships for students pursuing careers in law, criminal justice, and public policy. Recipients became part of a growing network of young leaders equipped to tackle systemic inequality from multiple angles. Another initiative focused on training journalists to report on issues of race and policing responsibly, ensuring accurate representation in media coverage. Evelyn also embraced technology as a tool for advocacy. Recognizing the power of digital platforms, she collaborated with tech experts to develop an app called Safe Witness, designed to help citizens document interactions with law enforcement safely and securely. The app included features like encrypted video storage, automatic alerts to trusted contacts, and access to legal resources. Within weeks of its launch, thousands downloaded the app, praising its potential to protect vulnerable individuals during encounters with police. Her innovative approach earned recognition beyond national borders. International human rights organizations invited Evelyn to speak at global forums, sharing insights from her experiences with audiences grappling with similar issues. In Geneva, she addressed the United Nations Human Rights Council, urging member states to prioritize accountability and equity in their own policing practices. Her speech resonated deeply, prompting several countries to review their policies and explore partnerships with justice beyond borders. Closer to home, Evelyn celebrated milestones that underscored the impact of her efforts. Cities implementing her recommended reforms reported significant reductions in complaints of racial profiling and use of force incidents. Independent oversight boards successfully investigated dozens of misconduct cases, leading to disciplinary actions against offending officers. Body camera footage proved instrumental in exonerating innocent civilians falsely accused of crimes, while simultaneously holding abusive officers accountable. Slowly but surely, the needle was moving in the right direction. Yet, Evelyn knew better than to declare victory prematurely. Data showed that disparities persisted, particularly in underserved neighborhoods disproportionately affected by over-policing and underinvestment. To address these inequities, she launched a new campaign called Equity First, focusing on economic empowerment and community revitalization. Partnering with businesses, nonprofits, and government agencies, the initiative invested in job training, programs, affordable housing projects, and youth mentorship opportunities. By tackling root causes of systemic inequality, Evelyn hoped to create environments where crime rates naturally declined, reducing reliance on punitive measures altogether. Through it all, Evelyn relied on her support network to stay grounded. Friends reminded her to celebrate small wins, even when larger battles loomed ahead. Family members encouraged her to take breaks, knowing burnout could jeopardize her ability to lead effectively, and colleagues offered fresh perspectives, challenging her assumptions and pushing her to think creatively about solutions. Perhaps the most rewarding aspect of Evelyn's journey was witnessing the ripple effects of her work. Communities inspired by her example began organizing their own reform efforts, adapting her strategies to fit local contexts. High school students formed clubs dedicated to promoting racial justice, hosting workshops and fundraisers to support related causes. College campuses buzzed with activism, as students demanded divestment from companies linked to mass incarceration and reinvestment in marginalized communities. Even corporate leaders started prioritizing diversity and inclusion, recognizing the moral and economic imperative of addressing systemic racism. By the end of the third year, Evelyn stood at a crossroads. Progress had been made, but the road ahead promised continued challenges. Resistance to reform showed no signs of abating, and the fight for true equality remained far from over. Still, Evelyn approached the future with hope and determination. She had learned that change wasn't linear. It ebbed and flowed, requiring patience, resilience, and unwavering commitment. And though the journey was long, she found solace in knowing she wasn't walking it alone. Together, Evelyn and countless others were proving that courage and unity could move mountains. Each act of defiance, each voice raised in protest, and each policy changed brought society closer to a world where fairness and justice weren't aspirations but realities. As she looked toward the horizon, Evelyn felt a profound sense of gratitude for the people who had walked beside her for the victories won and for the promise of a brighter tomorrow. The arc of history bent toward justice, yes, but only because brave individuals refused to let it stray from its course. By the fourth year of her advocacy journey, Judge Evelyn Carter had become more than just a symbol of resilience. She was a catalyst for change. Her tireless efforts to dismantle systemic racism within law enforcement had yielded tangible results, inspiring movements across the country and even internationally. Yet as much as progress had been made, Evelyn knew that the battle against deeply ingrained injustices was far from over. The final chapter of her story wasn't one of victory or defeat but of legacy, a testament to what could be achieved when courage met determination. The reforms she championed were now bearing fruit in unexpected ways. Cities implementing independent oversight boards reported not only fewer complaints of misconduct, but also improved relationships between police departments and the communities they served. Officers trained in de-escalation techniques and implicit bias awareness found themselves better equipped to handle tense situations without resorting to force. Body cameras provided transparency, exonerating both civilians and officers in contentious cases. These successes reinforced Evelyn's belief that accountability didn't weaken law enforcement. It strengthened it by rebuilding trust. But Evelyn's work extended beyond policy changes. Through her nonprofit, Justice Beyond Borders, she continued to empower marginalized communities, ensuring they had the tools and resources needed to advocate for themselves. One of the organization's most impactful initiatives was the creation of a nationwide hotline where citizens could report incidents of racial profiling and receive legal guidance. Calls poured in daily, revealing patterns of abuse that might otherwise have gone unnoticed. Data collected through the hotline informed new legislative proposals, keeping the pressure on lawmakers to act. Evelyn also turned her attention to education, recognizing that lasting change required addressing ignorance and prejudice at their roots. She partnered with schools to develop curricula focused on racial justice and civic responsibility. Students learned about historical struggles for equality alongside modern-day challenges, fostering empathy and understanding. Teachers received training on how to facilitate difficult conversations about race and privilege, equipping them to guide young minds toward critical thinking. In one particularly moving moment, Evelyn visited a high school where students presented her with a mural they'd painted depicting key figures in the fight for civil rights, including her own likeness. It was a humbling reminder of the impact her story had on future generations. As her influence grew, so did the recognition she received. Award ceremonies honored her contributions with speeches praising her unwavering commitment to justice. News outlets featured profiles detailing her journey from a federal judge harassed by racist police to a national leader in the movement for reform. Documentaries chronicled her efforts, highlighting both the triumphs and setbacks she endured along the way. But Evelyn remained humble, often deflecting praise onto the countless individuals who supported her mission. "This isn't my fight alone," she would say during acceptance speeches. "It's ours." Despite the accolades, Evelyn faced moments of doubt. Some days the weight of the struggle felt unbearable. Resistance to reform persisted, with entrenched systems fighting tooth and nail to maintain the status quo. Budget cuts threatened funding for vital programs, forcing her team to make painful decisions about which initiatives to prioritize. Anonymous threats continued to arrive, reminding her that speaking truth to power came with risks. Yet, even in her darkest hours, Evelyn drew strength from the people around her. Friends reminded her to celebrate small victories, while family members encouraged her to take breaks when exhaustion loomed. Colleagues offered fresh perspectives, challenging her to adapt strategies when old ones faltered. One of the most transformative developments during this period came when Evelyn expanded her focus globally. Invited to speak at international forums, she shared insights from her experiences with audiences grappling with similar issues. From Brazil to South Africa, activists sought her counsel on how to address systemic racism within their own policing systems. Inspired by her approach, several countries implemented versions of her recommended reforms, including independent oversight boards and mandatory body cameras. Evelyn traveled extensively, meeting with leaders and grassroots organizers alike, emphasizing the importance of tailoring solutions to fit local contexts. Her message resonated universally. True justice required collective action and unwavering persistence. Back home, Evelyn celebrated milestones that underscored the growing momentum of her movement. A landmark Supreme Court decision struck down qualified immunity in cases involving egregious misconduct, paving the way for greater accountability. Several states passed legislation mandating comprehensive training programs for all law enforcement officers, focusing on cultural competency and mental health awareness. Corporations began divesting from companies linked to mass incarceration, redirecting funds toward community revitalization projects. Even Hollywood took notice, producing films and television shows centered on themes of racial justice and police reform. Through it all, Evelyn never lost sight of why she had started this journey. It wasn't about personal glory or vindication. It was about creating a world where everyone, regardless of race or background, could live free from fear of discrimination or violence. She often reflected on the night she was pulled over, remembering the fear and anger she had felt. That experience had ignited her fight, but it was the stories of others that kept her going. Every testimony shared, every life touched, and every voice raised in defiance fueled her determination to keep pushing forward. As the years passed, Evelyn's role evolved. While she remained actively involved in advocacy, she also dedicated time to mentoring the next generation of leaders. Young activists looked to her for guidance, seeking advice on how to navigate the complexities of social justice work. She encouraged them to stay grounded in their values, listen to those most affected by injustice, and remain open to collaboration. Change doesn't happen overnight, she told them, but every step counts, no matter how small. Her legacy was evident not just in the policies enacted or the lives transformed, but in the culture shift she helped inspire. Conversations about race and policing, once taboo or divisive, had entered mainstream discourse. Schools taught lessons on systemic inequality, businesses prioritized diversity and inclusion, and media outlets amplified underrepresented voices. Slowly but surely, society was beginning to confront its flaws, and Evelyn stood at the forefront of that reckoning. For Evelyn, the journey was far from over. There were still battles to fight, injustices to address, and hearts to change. But as she reflected on how far she'd come, she felt a profound sense of gratitude, not just for the victories won, but for the people who had walked beside her every step of the way. Together, they had proven that courage, persistence, and unity could move mountains. And though the road ahead promised obstacles, Evelyn faced it with unwavering hope, knowing that the arc of history bent toward justice, one courageous act at a time. In the end, Evelyn's story wasn't just about her. It was about the countless lives touched by her advocacy, the communities empowered to demand change, and the ripple effects of a single act of defiance. Her courage had sparked a movement, one that would continue to grow long after the headlines faded. And though the fight for equality remained ongoing, Evelyn knew she had done her part. For that, she could rest easy, knowing that her legacy would endure, inspiring others to pick up the torch and carry the fight forward.